you're teaching the same material to multiple groups at the same time, kind of don't make accurate enough notes when you're like, did I do that? So one thing I wanted to just briefly mention about trauma. I was reading the newspaper the other day, and they had an article in there about the fact that if you drank orange juice, it helped with symptoms of depression. And it's funny because I see those things, and I'm taking a research class for my MSW right now, and they talk about how some studies are more valid than others, which we all kind of know. But I do think it is important to kind of just watch out for those articles and just scan through them and then go back and see if you can find what study or who did the study or who's promoting that information. And so on that particular one, just out of curiosity, I looked, and it's actually on a reputable website, NIH, as far as anything can be, as far as health and food. And it did say that drinking orange juice 3 times a day for like 8 weeks lowered or improved depressive symptoms in young adults with mild depression or mild depressive disorder. Interesting. So it's just those little tweaks that sometimes you could give a parent or a person. It's not going to make a tremendous amount of difference necessarily, but I noticed working with the refugees in particular, just sometimes I feel like the empowerment of feeling like there was something specific and concrete and doable that they could participate in that would help their children and help them, I think almost did as much good as the actual whatever it was. Almost like sort of a placebo effect, if that makes any sense.
You don't think it was the vitamin C?
Pardon?
You don't think it could have been the vitamin C?
Oh, I think definitely the orange juice could help. But my point is just basically that, the walks we were talking about the other week, taking a really long walk every day, it's been shown to reduce depression, sometimes as much as the medications do. It helps promote more quality sleep. It helps work off stress. It helps work off anxiety. Like, it does have positive things. But I think also when you're in a situation where everything has been bad for a long period of time and it feels like everything is out of control and you haven't had any say in all this negative stuff, whether it's a war or a death or an illness or whatever, all this bad stuff has been happening. So you're going through this trauma that everything feels out of control. Just to be told that there's something you can control that will improve things, I think that in and of itself is helpful. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah, it makes sense.
So I'm always looking out for these little things. It's not like I'm going to go back and rewrite the book and put in about orange juice, because honestly, you guys, from the egg thing, next week they could say it makes depression worse. You just don't know with food and things like that. But I just feel like sometimes some people, the first few things they try don't work as well, or maybe they don't want to take long walks. And so it's always good to have a few of these extra ones in your back pocket, so to speak. So when you're having these conversations, you're like, well, okay, so I don't know if this is working on because I haven't tried it, but I looked and there is some science behind it. Try this new thing, because, and we'll talk about this more as we get into the spiritual aspect. One of the biggest problems with trauma, whether it's from anything really, is this loss of hope. And so having these things that they feel like they can do kind of gives them some of that hope back, that things can feel somewhat under control again, that things can maybe get better, that they can, either the kids or they can heal. And so, so that's just my advice as you go forward after all of this. Just keep your eyes out for those kinds of articles, because you just never know what you're going to find. Also, last time we talked about bibliotherapy, and I don't know, I know some of you only deal with adults, but I want to share the stuff with children too, because you never know when you're going to run across a parent that wants some ideas for their kids. And bibliotherapy, if you remember, was the idea of taking books and stories and reading them to younger children or reading them simultaneously with teenagers and then talking about them. And really, you could do it with adults too. It's just a platform for talking about emotions or situations that are similar. And so I just wanted to share.
You said bibliotherapy?
Bibliotherapy, yeah. So like a therapist, a real quote unquote real therapist would actually use these things at a formal treatment plan. I don't think they really use them to diagnose. We can't do that, but we can still read these books to the children and have conversations with them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of lay therapy, especially recently. But so I was just going to
share. And I just want to comment. I mean, Katie, a lot of what Healing Hearts does when they read the books and then the activities, that's kind of what she's referencing.
Exactly. That's what bibliotherapy kind of is. It's designed so maybe you don't have a direct conversation with a child or a teenager or even an adult about whatever happened for whatever reason, but you want to address some of the emotions or the situation itself. And by putting that situation or that emotion onto a third person, i.e. the character in the book, then it's kind of like we talked about, puppets can be a mask. It's kind of like the book is a mask, and they can share their feelings without admitting that's the way they're feeling. Because, well, if I were that person, I would blah, blah, blah. You see what I'm saying? It's kind of like it's just another tool, honestly. So I just wanted to show some of the kids' books. Like, for instance, the Bernstein Bears have a lot of them. I want to say they are Christian. The books are not necessarily always overtly Christian themselves, but they kind of promote those ideals. And this one is Kindness Counts. They have just basic ones on prayer about I can talk with God, encouraging them to use, because that's a big one. Prayer and emotions. I really encourage, especially older kids and teens and adults, to pray their emotions to God. And we talk about the Psalms and David, and because they need to talk to somebody. And if they're reluctant to talk to a real person, talking to God is going to give them even a better benefit, in my opinion. But it'll give them a way to talk. But there's a book called It's Okay to Feel Sad, which might go into what you guys do. It's by Carolyn Larson, which it was a good one. I found this one, A Terrible Thing Happened.
I love, And
that's just more of a generic. It doesn't really ever specify what the terrible thing is. There are other ones that, depending on what you're working, like this one, I do a lot of urban ministry. This is Dina misses her mom. And if I remember correctly, the mom has been incarcerated. I think that's what's going on with that one. Feeling Afraid. And even, like, honestly, with kids, I found just personally in dealing with the mourning situation that you guys are dealing with, there's that sadness, but there's also a fear in a lot of children. I remember when my daughter she was probably second or third grade, one of their classmates' mothers had breast cancer since kindergarten. And she died one day when the kids were at school, and somehow the kids found out during the school day. And the rumor just was like spreading like wildfire through the school. And I had come over as a parent. I don't remember what I was doing. I don't remember, it was a PTA thing or something, but I was in the classroom and the teacher had left the room. So I'm with these children as they've just found out their classmate's mother had died. And they immediately were all panicking that their mothers were going to die. It was like their first thought at that age was that, this fear that my mother is going to die too. So that's what they needed most at that moment, was like reassurance that, your moms are all fine and it's going to be fine. You can talk about this with them when you get home and that kind of thing. So the fear one's good. Also, and this is going to sound weird too, I always keep an eye out in places like Target during the school section when they start up the school year, and in places like Five Below. Do y'all have Five Below up there?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Five Below has a little book area.
Is that, that's
The
the
temperature,
store,
I'm like,
right?
yeah, it's probably below here sometimes.
Well, not the temperature of the store. um, they
I've
have a
heard
little
of it.
book area, and I found some really good books for working with that kind of thing. This one, I want to say I found this at Target, but it might have been Five Below. And it's just a feelings book.
Oh.
And it's just got lots of little things in it. And it's one of those ones that you can wipe it. It's got the marker, but you can wipe it clean again and use it over and over again. So just always keep your eyes open for stuff like that. I mean, I'll be honest, if my husband were in the room, he would roll his eyes. But we literally have a room in our house that's just for ministry stuff like this because I never know when I'm going to use what I need. And it's always a wreck. But I try to grab stuff like that. What else did I want to show you? This is show and tell.
Who did you say wrote A Terrible Thing Happened?
Let me see. Hang on.
I like the open-endedness of that because
Yeah. The
you
Terrible Thing Happened is by, let's see, Margaret Holmes, Holmes. And it's a raccoon. I assume that's a raccoon on the cover.
Okay, thanks.
I have that book, Connie, if you'd like it.
Oh, I would love to see that. Yeah. I think that sounds really good. It'd be great for discussion. You know, what do you think happened? And then they project what happened in their lives.
Right.
The other thing tangentially connected, and you guys will have to draw some lines to what you're doing. I usually use this with foster parents. There is a storytelling method that a friend of mine from Minnesota, she adopted, I think I might have mentioned it, she adopted an older child and was just having a lot of issues and they had tried everything. But there's this group, and I think they're in Minnesota also, and they have this therapy where they use storytelling, and they use it in different ways. They use it for adoption and foster to help the kids kind of work through all the issues connected with that. But they also use it for behavior stories. And I think that it could be adapted to be used in helping kids process trauma, although they don't directly address that. Basically, the gist of the method is that they use animals to tell what they feel like are similar stories. Mm-hmm. So the animals go through the things. And I was talking to my friend because she said she actually used it with her adopted child when she was like middle school age, which to me is kind of on the upper edge of where that would work well. And she said it's really interesting because I said, well, what happens if you guess wrong? Because especially adoption and fostering, you don't always know the true story. And it's not always in their file or whatever. And she said it was really interesting because if she told a story and it didn't hit, it wasn't the same. It was just like a story to her child. But when one night she managed to form a story that just happened to be exactly what had happened to her child, she said the child just, it was like the fountains just opened up and the child just bawled. And it kind of scared her at first if she hadn't taken the class, she said, but she kept asking her to tell the story over and over, like several, nights in a row. And then it was just like poof, like it had just healed a wound just by addressing it through the story. So the book is called Connecting with Kids Through Stories. It is an extremely wonky book. It's a hard read, I'll be honest. But it is very effective. And what they do with the behavior story, so the animals, let's say the child's doing, I don't know, can't think of a school behavior right now, but maybe she's talking out in class or something and always getting in trouble. Well, instead of fussing at the child or saying you need to do this or that, the story will have the animal getting in trouble in school for the same thing. But then in the course of the story, the animal child learns some new tactics or whatever that will help them behave better. The data is really good. It's called Connecting with Kids Through Stories. And it's got a ton of authors. Let me see the first one so you can find it. Lacher, Lacher, Denise is the first one. And it's through, I was looking to see if it says the name of the group. Yeah, it's the Family Attachment and Counseling Center. in Minnesota. It's true. And they actually have a pretty good newsletter too, online newsletter that they can send to you guys. So that's another technique when you're working with kids and teens, especially kids more so, is this actual storytelling. I think I can't remember, it was last week, I guess last time we talked about the breathing and the exercises and things. If I'm trying to get parents to do it with their kids, what I generally will do is you can find cute little things like this online, and I just print them off and laminate them and give them to the parents to take home. And there's some other ones for like very simple stretching exercises that they can do with their kids, just so they have something concrete. I know when we were in Ukraine last year, I took one of our elders' wives with us, and she actually is a Pilates / yoga instructor. And she actually did a routine with them, and then they recorded it. And then they used the recording to go home and do it with their kids and grandkids and things like that. So both of those work for that kind of thing. Anything on any of that? Okay, so I wanted to go back on resilience. I think I started out talking about how the relationship with a parent or an adult was the most important factor in building resilience in young people. But there are other things that you can work with adults even on that will improve their resilience. Not just resilience exercises, which you can do those too, but they're specific characteristics. So there are 3 personality characteristics that make people naturally more resilient. And I tell parents and people, if you're not born with these natural characteristics, personality traits, you can be taught skill sets that will make you more that way. You will never naturally be that way, but just becoming more that way by using these skill sets will naturally make you more resilient. So the first of them is optimism, which just makes total sense. I'm a natural optimist, card carrying and all the good stuff. My husband is not. And so it's funny when something happens, like where our minds immediately go. So what I tell people, if you are working with someone who's a natural pessimist, you're not going to be able to change necessarily their general nature. But what you can do is try to teach them how to look for a silver lining, for lack of a better term.
Mm-hmm.
So like, okay, your minds naturally go like worst case scenario, versus an optimist will be like, well, this good thing can happen. So what you're training to do is like, okay, instead of immediately assuming the worst, what are some good things that could happen? And, you know, if you're allowed to work from a Christian's perspective, that's even easier, because you can say, okay, well, wait a second. How would God look at this? Or how would God want you to look at this? Or what are some good things that God can make come from this? Which is my preferred way to do that. But if you're in a situation where you're discouraged from using Christian language or whatever, then just go into okay, but wait, let's look at this. What are some good things that could come of this? Or what are some better scenarios that might happen than the one your mind is naturally going to? And just get that person in the habit, okay, your mind's going to want to go there, but let's wait a second and let's see if we can't think of something positive first. Mm-hmm. And it's almost like retraining them how to think about something that happens. So it's going to be slow and laborious, but it can be done. They're probably can't become a full natural optimist, but they can get better at that, and that will make them more resilient. So, you know, if the car doesn't start, I'm going to have to buy a new car and I can't afford a new car, and, you know, and they start spiraling. You're teaching them to stop the spiral and say, okay, but maybe it's just something minor, like you forgot to put gas in last night, or, you know, something like that. Like, think of the better things that could happen. The next one is accepting change. People that are naturally resilient change is exciting and fun to them, it doesn't upset them. And I may have shared this with you guys. For me, I love change. That's fun for me. Like I get excited. I kind of get bored when there's not change going on, which is a good thing because my life is full of it. It's good that I naturally am that way. Our daughter was not born that way. My husband's not naturally that way. So with her, like she would literally, when she was very tiny, she would get upset when there was a change. Like we were going to something stupid, like going to a new restaurant. She would be like, but we manufactured small changes that we knew would be positive. And that after she had the experience and we went through the trauma of it ourselves, and we say, see, that wasn't so bad. That was fun. And now she will suggest, as an adult, now she will suggest, changes. And she studied abroad and loved it and traveled all over. So, but it is a process if you're not naturally like that. That is when I think can become something that they embrace if you work with someone enough that doesn't like change. She still is a nurturing kind of bubble person, but she definitely will try new restaurants and new foods and travel and do all those fun things because we worked with her a lot when she was little. And then the third personality thing for resilience is making friends easily. This can be especially a struggle for not necessarily even introverts, but people with certain special needs, especially like if they're on the autism spectrum. Mm-hmm. A lot of times the behaviors can, especially at young ages, can be somewhat off-putting to peers. And so it's more difficult for them to make friends. You can work with people that struggle. If they're children, they have these scripts like Reader's Theater kind of things that they can read through and practice. You can also help people if they're older kind of reflect on some of these behaviors or ways of acting that maybe are off-putting that makes it harder for them to make friends if that's the issue. If they're just shy and not necessarily comfortable putting themselves out there to meet new friends, you can help talk them through ways that they can gradually become more comfortable with meeting new people or interacting with new people, giving them a toolbox, for lack of a better term. This is what I say when I meet somebody new. I ask them a question, what are some questions you could ask? Those sorts of things to kind of give them those skills. So those personality things are moving them towards those personality things will make them more resilient. And then the last big group is actually things anybody can be taught easily. You can use games and things like that a lot, but it's your executive functioning skills. So like problem solving, planning, time management, all those things will make people more resilient. Because if you think about it, at the end of the day, lack of resilience is something bad happens and you immediately just collapse in a puddle of tears. And you just give up all hope. Whereas if you're resilient, yes, you're still going to be upset. Yes, you still may cry. But then part of you goes, okay, but wait a second. What can we do to work through this issue and get to the other side of it? And that is what all of this is designed to do, these problem solving things. And so there's books that you can do with kids that have like those sorts of things. There's all sorts of board games, strategy games, all those sorts of things will help them be more resilient. It's just getting them into the mindset of, I don't have to wait to be rescued. I can start figuring out how to get out of this situation or improve things in some way. Does that all make sense?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, and that can be done at any age. My son-in-law, when we were out there the other week, he was saying that some of the private schools near Pepperdine had burned down and the kids had been relocated. And so they had found out Pepperdine had this program for their students, and they've actually got him and his team coming into these schools and working with middle school students and elementary students who were struggling with the trauma from the fire. So resilience is very helpful in all those sorts of things. Did we talk about behavior at all very much last time?
I think you had said something along the lines of traumatized kids actually function better in a more controlled environment in which they know what's expected and things like that.
Right. Okay. So that really is true across the board. That I found with refugees, and I'm sure this probably applies to some of what you guys do too. Anytime you have something traumatic happen, it tends to upset the whole world. Do you know what I mean? Your schedules get thrown off. Everything just gets thrown off because this big, huge whatever has come into your life. And
Mhm.
so the quicker you can get people back to some semblance of normalcy, whether it's a schedule, a routine, getting back to work, even though it's hard, maybe not going a full day, but working from home, it's anything that you can do to get them back into a more controlled environment is going to feel comforting to them. Now, do y'all deal with children very much at all, or parents of children in what you're doing?
Mhm.
Do we
Oh, yeah.
do what?
Mhm.
Parents, working with parents. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm going to go, if you stop me if I said all this before, but I'm going to back up a little bit and go more into behavior. Because honestly, other than the psychological part of the kids being upset or wanting night lights, the behavior is what really upsets parents. Because what happens is parents tend to drop all rules or any semblance of parenting during a traumatic episode just because they don't have the bandwidth to deal with it themselves. So
Mhm.
rather than continually debating with their child that it's time to go to bed, it's easier just to let the child stay up until the child falls asleep. You know what I'm saying? And so things just then start spiraling behavior wise. But then what happens if the child is traumatized too, then they start having behaviors that look like rebellious behaviors to the parent and can be dangerous to the child and have to be addressed, but they're addressing them the way they would normally address misbehavior. And you can't handle these behaviors the same way. They don't respond to them. And so then you start seeing this butting of heads, especially if they have teenagers. We saw that a lot with the Ukrainians, because they're in these not great situations a lot of times where they're all crammed into one room, suddenly a whole family. And so it's just not a ideal situation to begin with, and the mother's there with all these kids, like it's just not good. And then the teens were just, it was just not good. So but then what I found, and what you guys may find, is as we were dealing with the trauma issues, we realized that there are already some underlying parenting issues that were just exacerbating the issues with the trauma caused. And so I started backing up and just readdressing some basic parenting things as far as behavior. And that helped a lot. So if you start having these conversations, think about backing up and figuring out how they were parenting their kids before the trauma, because you may find out that there were parenting issues that need to be addressed in general that will help the whole situation. So, for example, one of the main mistakes parents tend to make when dealing with their children's behaviors is they tend to overcorrect mistakes and undercorrect for rebellion. And the reason you do that is because generally, especially with a child, a mistake is a big mess. In other words, they accidentally knock over a glass of milk and everything's, a mess, or they knock over something and they break it and it's expensive. But the truth is that accident could have happened to the parent. It wasn't 9 times out of 10, maybe even 99 out of 100. The child is not knocking their milk over on purpose. They're not breaking the lamp on purpose. It was just because they're clumsy and they're growing and they don't necessarily make great choices, but it wasn't a rebellious thing. So what I tell parents for mistakes, yes, definitely. If they're old enough, they should help clean it up. They should make some sort of atonement, but this is not the time you send them to the room or, put them on restriction or, whatever, because it was an accident. Just like you trip and break things sometimes, or you knock things over or spill things and make a huge mess. that's just part of life. And so, yes, they have to learn, they have to clean up their messes, but this is not the same as rebellion. And that's what parents have to learn to differentiate when their children do something that upsets them, is what you're trying to really focus your correction on is rebellion, because that's what's going to cause problems with God later on. If you don't correct rebellious behavior and deal with your child's rebellious attitude, they're not just going to rebel against you. Eventually, they're going to rebel against other authority, and they're going to rebel against God. It's the rebellious attitude you're trying to root out of them or not let take root in their hearts. And so that's when you talk about the consequences, whatever that is in their household. And that can be another whole conversation in some situations, but so that's what you're trying to do. So, and then if you have parents with kids with special needs, there's then a whole nother level, because for instance, if the child has fetal alcohol syndrome, which you can't always tell by looking at them, and doctors don't, and schools don't always diagnose that well. But if they have fetal alcohol syndrome, those parents are over punishing, because a child can know how to do something perfectly well one day with that syndrome, and then the next day have no clue how to do it. And they honestly don't. That's how their brain is working. And so with special needs parents, I have to caution them. It's like, you have to be very careful. Your child may look like they're being rebellious, but it just may be they literally don't remember how to do something, or that you told them to do something. So it's not, once again, it's not rebellion. They're not saying, I don't care that you told me to do that. I'm not doing it just because they literally don't remember how to do it, or they don't know how to do it. Trauma then as a whole nother layer, and I think we did talk about this a little bit, because when your kid has been traumatized, especially if it's an ongoing kind of situation, they very likely can be in that hypervigilant lower brain, for lack of a better way of phrasing it simply, which means they're not able to make those higher level decisions that they need to make good moral choices or good choices in general. Their brain is basically prepared to help protect them from the bear, for lack of a better term. And so it gives them the three, which you're familiar with, I'm sure, the fight, flight, or freeze. And so those can look like rebellious behaviors. If they knock over a lamp, let's say, and it's an accident, or it could be rebellion, it doesn't matter, but they knock over the lamp and you holler, what just happened? Their brain goes in that lower hypervigilant brain if they've had a lot of trauma. And if they are in flight mode, they're going to run for it. Well, to a parent, that looks like you're running to be rebellious so you don't have to, whatever. And that can set a parent off. Same thing with if they become combative, which is the fight, or they just don't respond at all. Why aren't you answering me? It's the parental response when the kid just shuts down and won't answer. You're going to be the parent's going to be in a really vicious no-win cycle if the kid is in their lower brain. And so until the parent can calm the child, you cannot deal with correction or with consequences if you think that's necessary. I'm not a fan of that for trauma behaviors, but they do need to be calm so that you can have a conversation of, hey, honey, when you hear a loud noise and that reminds you of a bomb going off or whatever the situation is that made them hypervigilant, and you could run into a street and get hit by a car. So that can't be your choice. Let's think of some other choices for that. Those kind of conversations can't happen when they're still in that lower brain. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes
And
sense.
so parents, if it's a one-time event, like a death in the family that's traumatizing a child or whatever, you may not need to have that conversation. But if it's some sort of hyper traumatic event that happened with it, maybe they were all in a car wreck or something, you know what I'm saying? If it's one of those kind of very traumatic situations, where the kid's brain has just, okay, I'm just got to protect you from everything because everything around you is dangerous, and they're operating from that hypervigilant state. The parents kind of need to be aware that they have to first calm their child, and then they can work on the correction. Because otherwise the kid's just going to keep spiraling, and you're not going to make the parent's not going to make any headway, and the kid is just going to get worse and worse and worse. And it's just kind of self-defeating situation. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it does.
Okay. And it's really important if you're working with families that have a lot of trauma in their background before whatever you're dealing with specifically. Because especially like in a situation where the family's had a lot of abuse in the background, or they're like in an urban setting with a lot of community violence, anything like that. If the child's a foster child, any of those kind of kids are susceptible to this flight, fight, or freeze behavior. And so whoever is caretaking for them needs to just understand this dynamic really well, so that the child can be helped and the parent is not frustrated. Because if the parent is in trauma too, remember, they are more susceptible to over punishing children to begin with.
Right.
And so then you've got a very volatile situation. And so sometimes training the parent a little bit better will make the parent calm down. And then that's lowers the chances that there's some abuse situation that can be starting. Let me see what else with behavior. And the main thing when you tell them as far as calming their children, it just depends on how worked up the child is. Sometimes you just get the child to breathe and say, it's going to be all right. Just calm down. Sometimes they'll need to hug them. And almost, I hate to use the word restrain because that has such negative connotation to it. But some kids that are, especially the ones that just want to run and they're trying to run somewhere dangerous, if it's a parent, especially, they do need to kind of just hug on to them until they kind of, and you can feel like if you've ever had a child, that you can feel them kind of relax into you. And that's when it's okay to start having those conversations. But you're just going to have to use your best judgment of what kind of parent you're working with. That's why I say it's sometimes helpful to say, well, how have you dealt with their behaviors in the past? Especially if you're working one-on-one. It's not necessarily great for a group situation. But if you're one-on-one, you can say, well, how have you kind of dealt with their behavior in the past when something's happened that you don't find acceptable? And try to get a feel for what kind of parenting style. Because I think we did mention before, you want to move them away from the authoritarian parenting style and the permissive parenting style. Both of those are not great for kids in trauma. You want to be in that authoritative, which the parent is very nurturing, but also has firm, clear boundaries that are enforced consistently and that kind of thing. The other thing and this once again, kind of is both ways. It's a general parenting issue, but also can be worsened with trauma, is this issue of impulse control, self-control, those kinds of things. And that I think is important just because that's if you're a Christian, especially, that's part of avoiding sin, is to have good self-control and impulse control. And they're similar, but slightly different. Self-control, you're kind of being more thoughtful, I think, about it, where impulse control is more of I just lash out. I just, I hit instead of thinking, that kind of thing, where self-control can be more, I have to have more self-control over my diet or my behavior or whatever. It's a little more of a thoughtful thing. The other thing to watch for with people in trauma, parenting in trauma, is watching for power struggles. I have a friend that is in urban ministry, and she likes to say the minute you start engaging in a power struggle with a child, then you're acting like they are. Basically, you've taken on the role of a child instead of the role of a parent. And so mostly the parenting advice that I give when it comes to power struggles is just, you've got to keep your emotion out of the equation, because when you start getting emotional, that's when power struggles really start ratcheting up. And so the best way to deal with the power struggle is just to be super, super calm, super, super unemotional. And just often it just is repeating yourself a lot of times. Like, I'm sorry, that's just not an option. No, you don't get to wear your bathing suit to school. I'm sorry, that's just not an option. So, you know, but the minute you start feeding into the emotion and start like screaming and yelling, blah, 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 that's when the power struggles just go through the roof, and just, it's nothing good happens once that start happening. Another thing that often will come up, and once again, this goes back to the parent-child dynamic before the current trauma, is this idea of manipulation. If you have a teenager that was already manipulating a parent before whatever happened, they can see this as an opportunity to do whatever they want and really up the manipulation. But I've also seen the opposite be true, where I had a situation in one country where a parent basically had just totally upended the children's lives. Obviously not because of the war per se, but the war she become a refugee with the children. The spouse had to stay behind fighting in the military, and she decided to not only have an affair in the new country, but divorce her spouse and was going to marry the new whatever, and wanted to know how I could teach her how to keep her children from manipulating her. And I was like, what? I don't understand. And basically what she wanted them to be excited that she had had this affair and left their father, and, was going to marry this strange man. And the father had come and tell, like, it was a whole drama. And so watch for that kind of things, because the reality is some adults do act out when they're under the stress of trauma. They will have affairs. They will do things like that. And then they have somehow convinced themselves it's okay because of the traumatic event that they've been through, that this excuses the decisions that they've made. But then they will accuse their children of trying to manipulate them for being upset because they're upset at the choices the parent has made. I know it sounds super, super complex, but I mean, the way I've handled those situations is just to really calmly say, your children are not manipulating you. You have totally destroyed what they have felt as their perfect life. Like, you've upset their world. That is a genuine emotion, and you're going to have to deal with that. And you all need to take them to a doctor, as we say over there.
Yeah, well, it sounds a lot like this adult is trying to justify their choices, their behavior, and using the children to manipulate them to make it okay.
It's a spiral. And so the more, like, sometimes you're going to have people that it's just this incident, it's very straightforward, it's very clean, you just deal with the trauma as it is. But other people come into these situations with all sorts of baggage and all sorts of trauma and all sorts of unhealthiness before, and this just exacerbates everything. And so you kind of have to be mentally prepared that you are going to have these people that will have these situations like this, that will use the new trauma as an excuse for, and it doesn't have to be an affair. It could be their excuse for going back into substance abuse or, anything else that was unhealthy before, or that they've always kind of sort of wanted to do. And this is their excuse. And so just be aware that that does happen. And then, like I said, like you were saying, they kind of project that onto their children, and just all kinds of stuff can come up. And so but it's the same sort of thing. And we do, like, if you go into the book, I do go into like, what is gaslighting, what is overstating, what is change, like if they have a teenager. I had a situation in one country where I felt so sorry for the Ukrainians, because none of them had smartphones that I knew before the war. They all had the old flip phones. They couldn't, but I guess a lot of these refugee groups gave them smartphones when they went into wherever. And so then the kids all became addicted to the phones because the parents anyways, it was just not a great situation. And so I had several parents, several different places said that like their children, they realized that the phones were not doing their children any favors. And so they would like threaten to take the phone away. And then the teenager would threaten to commit suicide if the parent took the phone away, those sorts of things. So there's just a lot, depending on what kind of traumas you're dealing with and how intense it is, that can come up. And so I do go through manipulation in case they have a child or manipulate them, so they kind of see like the types of ways that can happen. But sometimes it's really not manipulation. It's just, like I said, with that other family, it was more the parent projecting on the child. So you just have to use your best judgment going into that. And the same thing, which where you are, I don't know how much culture there is involved and how parents, punish, correct their children. That becomes an issue down deep south where I am sometimes, or in other cultures. And so you just have to kind of use your best judgment on that too. Conflict resolution. If you go on our website or you go in the book, we actually have taken the conflict resolution model that Pepperdine Law School teaches. It supposedly at one time was #1 in the country. And it's basically just a simple, basic conflict resolution model that we teach, because conflict obviously does come up in a lot of situations in trauma. And so, but you've probably seen it before. It's a variation of the, each party stating what they want and then working to find unique solutions, not just I get my way, you get your way, or we compromise in something that neither one of us likes. Studies have shown that if you go a little bit longer, work a little bit harder, there's usually other solutions that make both people happier. But most people just assume there's only those 3 options. And so, but it's kind of listening to each other, restating to make sure you're understanding each other, just the basics. But it's amazing if you think about it. Parenting advice generally is when small children in conflict, just let it work them out for themselves. And that's like the very worst parenting advice that is consistently given. Because what is a couple of 4-year-olds going to do? They're going to beat each other up. They're going to they're going to scream at each other. It's not mature conflict resolution. And so nobody ever teaches us, for the most part, healthy conflict resolution skills. This is why we have road rage. This is why we have people having screaming fits in stores and cursing each other out and, all these sorts of misbehaviors we see in public, because parents were told to just let the kids work it out for themselves. No. We need to start really actively teaching people godly, safe, healthy conflict resolution skills. And so that can be an added benefit to what you're doing as you're working with people after they've gotten through the initial trauma, started teaching them. In the same way, and this is more of an issue in cultures that like Ukraine, where there is an anger kind of underlying cultural thing a lot of times. So we do spend time talking about anger management strategies. And once again, this is just simple, basic stuff that we assume everybody knows, like counting to 100, walking out of the room until you calm down, like just praying about it, just the basics. But it's amazing how many people don't have those basic skill sets. And so if anger comes up when you're counseling somebody, talk about that. Like, well, what do you do when you get angry? How do you manage that anger? You know, and it's amazing how many people don't. And then sometimes too, that it's interesting, especially Christian people sometimes have in their minds that certain anger management techniques are not appropriate, especially I know I don't even know why she went through this phase, but when our daughter was small, she went through a phase where I guess she just didn't have enough words really at that age to really express her anger adequately. So have you ever seen that blow up bozo that you can punch it and it'll bounce back up?
Yes.
So we literally got her one of those. And when she would get frustrated, we would go, it's like a punching bag. It's like taking kickboxing. It was a safe way for her to work out aggression that didn't hurt anybody. But some people really struggle with letting people have any aggression at all. But I think that is a natural part of being super, super angry, is feeling very aggressive. So I would rather have somebody take that aggression out on a punching bag than on a person or on a wall. You know what I'm saying? So, but I don't push that if people are like, oh no, I don't want any aggression at all. I'm like, okay, well then you better get your kid out running a lot or something, because they've got to get that energy out of them. But I personally don't have a problem with a punching bag or something that's safe. And as long as they understand that is the appropriate way to take out those feelings, not on a human being or property or something like that. Any questions about any of that?
Mm-mm.
And I think depending on what you're dealing with, like if you're dealing with a situation where like somebody was killed with a DUI or something like that, that those anger conversations are probably really important ones to have versus other types of grief. Okay. The other thing that we briefly talked about, I think we did talk about this, about having kids serve other people as a great way of healing. We did talk about that, didn't we?
Like in a volunteer capacity, or
Yeah. Did we talk about that with you? I thought that I talked about that with you guys. Okay. So, all right. So, and this kind of does go into the spiritual part of it, but also I think other aspects of healing. There is a tendency when you are going through trauma or mourning or whatever that everybody serves you. Everybody's trying to make you feel better. So they're always doing something for you, which is great. That's wonderful. That's kind of how it should be, hopefully. The problem is if this goes on for a very long time, it can make you feel like a victim. And you are a victim for that thing, but you don't want them to have a victim mentality, that they always have to be saved, that they always have to be taken care of, because it keeps them from having self-efficacy. It makes them believe that they can't do anything for themselves to make their situation better, which is very dangerous mindset. But it can also, on another end of the spectrum, in a different way, it can also make them begin to feel entitled. We saw this, we helped start an orphanage in Mexico, and pretty early on, the kids started being really entitled, and we're like, how is this even happening? But we realized it's because they were used to everybody serving them. And so we started making them serve other people, and the attitudes changed. So I was in The Hague working with a group of teenagers from Ukraine. Great group of kids, love these kids. But we decided that it would be really good for them to do something for the congregation that had been hosting them for all these months. And so we came up with this project where they were one of these small congregations that had just like one children's ministry room that looked like it hadn't been decorated since 1945. You know, the kind that has all the old coloring sheets on, you know, just was a hot mess, and nothing ever be thrown away or cleaned or whatever. So we took it on. We volunteered to the church that we would totally clean out and decorate that room for the children. And then they made snack mix for all the people that attended that congregation. We're going to give them each a bag of snack mix and wrote these thank you notes. And I thought, well, because we had some middle school boys in the group, and I was just like, we weren't sure how this was going to go over because we were making them like sweep and clean up things and move things, like things that normally kids hate doing. Those kids had more fun. They got into it so much. They were even like trying to write the notes in English because they didn't really know Dutch, but they knew English better than Dutch, and they knew most of the people in the Netherlands speak English. And so they were like trying to write the thank you notes in English so that people could actually read them. And they just got into it. And this went on for several hours. And we were just kind of like, interesting. Well, after it was over, every one of them came up and thanked the adults for letting them serve someone else. And we realized, and so now we've started doing that a lot of different places because we realized that was the first time in a really long time that they felt like they had something to give. And that was so joyful for them. That was so empowering to them to know that they weren't going to always be the victim, that they could help other people, that they had something to give to other people. So I really encourage you when you're working with people that, especially people that have undergone trauma for a longer period of time. Maybe somebody was really, really sick for a very long time and their life had to revolve around that or whatever, to get them serving somebody else in some way. And if you think about it, like Mothers Against Drug Driving, some of those things came out of that very kind of idea of turning a tragedy into something to help somebody else. And you have to manage it carefully because not everybody's ready for that. But for those who are, it also is a great distraction, for lack of a better term. It gets to them. Like if you think about yourself, sometimes when you're just in not a great mood, if you go serve somebody else, how much better you feel. It can have that same emotional impact too. It's just getting you out of your head, always thinking about yourself and your own problem, thinking about somebody else and helping somebody else kind of shifts your mindset. So I highly recommend that. One of the things that we did with that particular group before we started is we talked about the gifts that God gives us to serve other people. And we did a gift identity exercise, identification exercise, not the spiritual gifts that we often talk about in church from 1 Corinthians, but I go back to when they were building the tabernacle. If you look back at the story, God gives craftsmen certain specific gifts to use to build the tabernacle. And they were like, sometimes they were just things like, I think it was like jewels, something to do with jewels and fabric or whatever. But that's what I try to get people to focus on because they're concrete. And my theory is if you're using the concrete gifts to serve God, then the other ones will come. You'll figure the other ones out later. Because people, especially kids and teens, can wrap their heads around the concrete things more. But don't just focus on like art and music and the drama and things like public speaking that we normally think about. Like organizing is a gift, generosity is a gift, humor is a gift, imagination, analyzing, asking questions, building, commuter coding, like really help them delve down and figure out. And that's what we did that night is we helped them identify what gifts they had. And then we looked at the projects that we wanted to do and put them on the projects that most closely matched the gifts that they had identified. And talked about that. So that's another thing to.
So where did you say in the Bible they talk about the early, like in the Old Testament about
it's in the Old Testament. If you look, and I'll have to look to find the exact scripture, but it's when they're building the tabernacle. So it's Leviticus, Numbers, one of those. It's in that part. But I can find the scripture for you. But if you look, it begins at the beginning of that chapter, and he talks about how God gave these people. Some of them were already craftspeople, and it's like it sounds like he gave them a little extra something. And then some of them, it sounds like that they weren't naturally gifted in those particular craft building skills or whatever. And he gave them the skills to build the tabernacle. So that's.
I was going to add, if you think about it, they were, a lot of them were slaves in Egypt. And so they might have had had been taught a lot of these skills, and so they applied those skills to building the tabernacle. So maybe in that sense, God kind of
No, but it actually
prepared them.
literally says God gifted Joe Schmo with the ability to do XYZ. So
Mhm.
the scripture literally talks about how God gave them specific gifts that he needed them to have. Now, I can't remember. It seems like some of them maybe are already doing that to an extent, and he just upped how well they were able to do it. And then some he just gave the gift, but it does literally address specific concrete talent type gifts.
Mhm.
And I've just found over the years that because if you start going into the spiritual gift inventories, I mean, I've taken a million of over the years, and I
Yeah.
pretty much sort of kind of know my gifts at this point. But if I don't start doing those inventories, a lot of them just don't really make a lot of sense. Or they try to force things like, oh, you have the gift of, whatever. I forget what all the spiritual gifts are, but you have the gift of this, so you should be filling communion cups. They just, it's like, it always feels forced. So
Mhm.
I've learned, like, if I go into a church, any church, doesn't matter big or small, doesn't matter where, and I ask people, how many of you feel fairly confident you've identified your gifts from God to serve him? Maybe 20% of the people raise their hands. So we've got 80% of our people that are basically probably not doing a lot of serving, or at least not in the ways God gifted them to serve, because they still don't know what their gifts are. But if you focus them on what they're good at, what they've been trained to do, what they do for a living, all those talents that they use every day, and you start convincing them to use them to serve God, they can put their brains around that. And then my theory is then those spiritual gifts in First Corinthians will start coming to the surface. Because honestly, a lot of those gifts, we still fight over which ones you can still get or not. You know what I mean? So we don't even do a great job of understanding it enough to teach somebody how to do it. So I've just found, especially when dealing with young people, it's just easier. And then that, like, oh, I'm good at that, and somebody needs me to do that for them, they can put those pieces together and serve other people. And then that's the self-efficacy, and all of that kind of snowballs in a positive direction for them. So I'm just a big proponent of that in general.
Yeah, I like that a lot.
The other thing to talk about, and this is more with teenagers and adults, is the idea of risk-taking behaviors. That is a natural response to some people for trauma, particularly evidently if they have what they call survivor's guilt. And survivor's guilt, they don't necessarily have to be in the exact same incident as the person that died. But if they were even in a similar, like they were both in the war, or they were both in something and one died and the other didn't, there is the survivor guilt, quote unquote, drives people to either do risk-taking behaviors / in such a way that they undermine their own future, because they don't feel like they deserve the future that they have that the other person no longer has because they died. And so they can undermine it in other ways. They're not risk-taking behaviors, but often that's how it manifests itself. And so this is what we're talking about, particularly alcohol, drugs, because also you're trying to self-medicate. Our young people are not implicitly taught, but through content that they watch, through their friends. If you want to forget something, you just go get drunk, or you just go, if you don't want to deal with it anymore, just go get high. Then you'll feel better, which, as we know, doesn't really help in the long term. It just makes things worse. But those are the messages they often get. And so those are the things they're going to try. And there are some aspects of it that probably does temporarily help in some cases. I don't personally buy into that, but I know some people will say that. But also, the literature shows that sexual acting out is also common risk-taking behavior for those who have been through trauma. So just watch for that. Make sure you're having those conversations when they're appropriate or necessary. And you guys all know the signs of that. So be sure, I'm trying to figure out how to word this carefully. If you're working with a teenager and you can tell they're high or you can tell they're drunk, don't just let it slide and write it off as well. Oh, they've been going through a tough time. They won't always be this way. Because, and I'm sure you guys are aware of this, they're adding fentanyl so much. Like pot now, marijuana now, it's not like when I was a teenager. Not that it was great then, but it often now has fentanyl in it. So it's addictive, physically addictive, where it wasn't physically addictive in the past. It's so strong now, it throws a lot of young people into psychosis. A lot of these street drugs now are just, I mean, I thought they were bad back in the day when people were ODing on heroin and stuff, but it just really literally is making, our daughter goes to Pepperdine. UCLA came out to talk to them. And some of the street drugs now are literally making people schizophrenic. So this is not something you let slide. Not that it ever should have been, but you really have to have some serious conversations. There was a teenager here in Atlanta that had been raped and the family didn't know it. And she took one pill and had fentanyl in it and she OD'd. So just really watch the teenagers and young adults, particularly about that kind of thing. Okay. I know I promise next time we'll get to the spiritual because I really want to get into that. I do want to just briefly address the academic impact. And this also will cross over into work life for your adults, primarily because trauma impacts your memory and your ability to focus. And so, and with older adults, it may already be like starting into early stages of dementia. It can exacerbate it greatly. And so obviously if they're missing school or whatever, their school is going to suffer. But also they found, and this was really interesting to me, they found, and it seems like worse with boys than girls for some reason, if they're separated from their parents for any length of time because of the trauma or for any reason, it could start messing with their test scores, particularly in language arts for some reason. Which is bad because, as we know, our schools are evidently not so great at math and literacy proficiency anymore. So kids are already struggling. It's just going to really throw them for a loop. The good news is for both memory and focus, doing a lot of like matching games and things like that can really help them get some of those skills back again, even for adults. And also just teaching them some memorization tools that you probably were taught when you were growing up for memorizing things for tests and things can help, like rhyming and singing things and that kind of stuff will help. Also be aware if you're working with adolescents, particularly there's so many social issues in the teen years that trauma can really upset their social relationships in school with their peers and just add to their trauma. So just be kind of watching out for that because they can cause social issues. Okay, next time I really want to go into the spiritual aspect. I think I shared this when I was doing the research for all of this. I found it very interesting. I found a couple of secular studies that admitted that the only kids that really fully healed from war trauma were children who were religious. And they think it is because some of the main issues that you have to process when you've been through war trauma, or I think any trauma, can only be adequately addressed by God. For example, hope, loss of hope. a secular person is going to try to give you hope that things are going to get better, but you can't promise that every time. Things are not necessarily going to get better. And so, but if your hope is in God, if your hope is in heaven, then that hope is not dependent upon your circumstances. And so those kids were able to heal because their hope wasn't based on how their circumstances were. So that's why I really want to delve into that next time and talk about some of the specific issues like forgiveness that really are stumbling blocks a lot of times from complete healing. And thankfully we can talk about that in the open straight ahead. So any questions on anything?
No, it was good.
Okay, so the next time, which will be our last time, we'll really spend all the time. I want to show you a method called Godly Play that you can use with children that hospital chaplains use a lot, and really kind of walk you through how to do that. But then also talk about the issues that teens and adults struggle with spiritually, and just kind of go through some ways of helping them look at things. Forgiveness is always fun. And I think we finally, after 3 years, have figured out a way to kind of work people through that. I do want to recommend this series of books. This was recommended me by the man who heads the counseling program at Faulkner University. And we got this, and actually our small group did these books, and we really found this helpful. It's called First Aid for Emotional Hurts by Edward Moody. He is a Christian. I don't know that he's Church of Christ per se, but these books are excellent. I loved this because for each thing that he suggests or recommends or whatever, he gives scriptures to go with it and Bible stories that go with it. So I love that because it's very, very rich in how to help people think.
His name again was
Edward Moody.
Edward.
Jr.
Okay.
And so this can be from the publisher. I tried to get the kit, but I think at the time they were out of the kit. But this is the main book. It's called First Aid for Emotional Hurts. So you can get that one, and that kind of talks you through the whole process of helping someone. But like I said, I love it because it has so much scripture in it, and it's used well. Like, sometimes people use scripture and you're kind of like, oh, that was a stretch. This guy really, because we went through it with a fine-tooth comb, and he really did a good job of, if you're talking like I just randomly opened it, and she's talking about somebody that's had somebody murdered, and he goes into it, but he goes into like what scriptures to use with that person to help them kind of work through it in much more detail than I'll be able to go into next time. So I highly, 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 highly recommend this book. The good thing, or the interesting thing that he did, was he wrote smaller ones that go into specifics. One is, this one's just basic making therapeutic change. One's helping children. There's one for finding help, one for sexual issues, one for helping children with learning problems. But the two for you guys, I think, would be most helpful is there's one for addiction and one for grief.
Yes.
Okay.
So I personally would suggest if you have the money, and they're not outrageously expensive. I think, the little ones were $4.99 each, and the big one was $17.99. And I'm sure through Amazon, you can probably get them on sale if you're lucky. But I definitely would get the main one, and then I would consider getting the grief one, and then also possibly the addiction one if you deal with that very often. I just thought these were excellent, excellent, excellent. And they are legitimately written for lay counseling. They're not for professionals. So they do suggest professionals and tell you how to get them that help if they need it. But that's an excellent resource. So I definitely would recommend both of those for them. Okay, guys, if you don't have anything else, I will see you in 2 weeks, and we will finish up with the spiritual aspect of it and really dive into that.